Saipan, Mariana Islands, November 24, 1944, 1300 hours, and Lieutenant Commander Sadamu Takahashi of the Imperial Japanese Navy's 252nd Air Group watched through his Mitsubishi A6M Zero's canopy as 111 Boeing B-29 Superfortresses approached Tokyo at 30,000 feet, their silver fuselages gleaming in the afternoon sun, and he prepared to lead his squadron in what he believed would be a standard interception, completely unaware that the American bombers carried revolutionary General Electric central fire control systems with analog computers manufactured by IBM that could automatically calculate lead on attacking fighters, making every traditional evasion tactic the Japanese had perfected over 3 years of war utterly useless. The moment Takahashi rolled his Zero into an attack position, approaching the massive 4-engine bomber from the 7 o'clock position at 400 miles per hour, something unprecedented happened that would shake his understanding of aerial combat, as the B-29's upper rear turret swiveled toward him before he even entered what he considered effective firing range. The twin 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns already spitting tracers that curved through the air exactly where his fighter would be in 2 seconds, not where it was now, forcing him to break off his attack run at 900 yards, well outside the 600-yard range where he expected to engage, while his mind raced to comprehend how the American gunner could possibly predict his flight path with such mathematical precision. What Lieutenant Commander Takahashi couldn't know, was that Technical Sergeant Robert Matthews, sitting in a heated, pressurized compartment in the B-29 named Tokyo Rose of the 497th Bombardment Group, wasn't actually aiming those guns directly but was instead operating a remote sighting station equipped with a K-14 gun sight connected to one of 5 General Electric analog computers, each weighing over 200 pounds and measuring 6 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet, that processed inputs from 2 gyroscopes measuring angular velocity, calculated ballistic drop based on altitude and air density, computed parallax correction for the 30-foot distance between sight and turret, and most critically, determined the exact lead angle needed to place bullets where the Zero would be, not where it appeared in the gunner's sight, all accomplished through electromechanical relays and cell-sins responding in milliseconds. 6 months earlier, in May 1944, Japanese military intelligence had studied captured B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 liberators shot down over Rabaul and the Netherlands East Indies, leading Colonel Koji Tanaka of the Army Air Force Headquarters to write in his classified report that American bomber defensive armament followed predictable patterns, with gunners manually tracking targets and firing where the enemy aircraft appeared in their sights, requiring Japanese pilots only to maintain irregular flight paths and exploit the 1 to 2 second human reaction time that created gaps in defensive fire, a tactical doctrine that had proven successful against hundreds of Allied bombers throughout the Pacific War. The Japanese Army Air Force had developed specific attack protocols based on extensive combat experience against B-17s and B-24s, with Major Terahiko Kobayashi of the Aquino Fighter School teaching pilots that American bombers required manual coordination between gunners, meaning that violent maneuvers at ranges under 800 yards would force gunners to constantly readjust their aim, creating windows for pressing home attacks with their 20mm cannons. And this doctrine had been so successful that Japanese pilots shot down dozens of B-24 liberators during raids on the oil refineries at Balikpapan, with pilots like Captain Yoshio Fukui of the 13th Flying Regiment claiming 5 heavy bombers using these exact tactics. The Imperial Japanese Navy had similarly refined their anti-bomber tactics through bloody experience over the Solomon Islands, where Lieutenant Junichi Sasai of the Tainan Air Group had developed the swooping hawk attack pattern, diving from above and behind at high speed, exploiting the fact that B-17 tail gunners had to manually track fast-moving targets through mechanical ring sights, physically wrestling with heavy machine guns against wind resistance while trying to calculate deflection. In their heads, a human limitation that gave attacking fighters crucial seconds to close within killing range of their Type 99 cannons. Even the Regia Aeronautica in Italy had studied American bomber defenses, with Major Giuseppe Balin of the 150th Fighter Group reporting after engagements with B-24 liberators over Sicily that the American gunners, while brave and determined, were fundamentally limited by human reaction times and the physical challenge of manually tracking a fighter traveling at 350 miles per hour while their bomber pitched and yawed through flak, observations that led Italian pilots to develop high-speed slashing attacks that minimized exposure to defensive fire. The German Luftwaffe, with vastly more experience against American heavy bombers than any Axis force, had documented through thousands of combat encounters that B-17 and B-24 gunners required an average of 1,000 rounds to achieve 20 hits on an attacking fighter, a statistical reality that Major Heinz Noak of Jagdgeschwader 11 attributed to the impossibility of human gunners accurately calculating the complex mathematics of deflection shooting while under combat stress, leading to the development of head-on attacks that exploited the bomber's weakest defensive angles. But the B-29 Superfortress represented a quantum leap in defensive technology that none of the Axis powers had anticipated, with General Electric's central fire control system using analog computers to solve ballistic equations in real time, processing data from multiple inputs including the navigator station where barometric altitude, indicated airspeed, and outside air temperature were continuously fed into the system, allowing each computer to calculate true airspeed and density altitude, while simultaneously computing corrections for gravity-induced bullet drop, wind deflection, and the parallax difference between the gunner's sighting station and the remote turret's position. The system's electromechanical genius lay in its use of celsins, essentially electrical motors that could transmit angular position data between the sighting station and the turret, working in conjunction with differential celsins that added the computer's calculated corrections to the gunner's aim point, while rate gyroscopes measured the angular velocity of target movement in both azimuth and elevation, feeding this data through a complex network of resistors that represented time of flight. Calculations based on range estimation, all integrated through hundreds of relays clicking away inside the computer housing like a deadly mechanical symphony. When Technical Sergeant Matthews tracked Lieutenant Commander Takahashi's Zero through his heated sighting blister, he didn't need to calculate lead or worry about parallax, but simply kept the illuminated reticle on the enemy fighter while adjusting a ranging dial that told the computer the target's wingspan, allowing the analog computer to instantly solve the complex trigonometry that determined exactly where those 50 caliber rounds needed to be aimed to intercept a target moving at a relative velocity of over 500 miles per hour, computations that would have taken a human mathematician minutes to solve with slide rule and paper. The computer's calculations included factors that no human gunner could process in combat, such as the fact that at 30,000 feet altitude, the reduced air density meant bullets would travel farther but drop more slowly than at sea level, while the B-29's true airspeed of 320 miles per hour created a lateral deflection that had to be added to the target's own angular movement, plus the Coriolis effect caused by the Earth's rotation, all while compensating for the 32-foot distance between the upper sighting blister and the upper rear turret. Lieutenant Commander Takahashi's wingman, Ensign Hiroshi Yamada, attempted a coordinated attack from the opposite side, diving in from 5 o'clock high at maximum speed, using the exact technique that had served him well against B-24s over Rebelle, but found himself under accurate fire at over 1,000 yards, with tracers from the B-29's lower rear turret converging on his flight path with impossible precision, forcing him to roll violently and dive away, his mind unable to process how the American gunner could track his 400-mile-per-hour diving attack with such mechanical accuracy. What made the situation even more bewildering for the Japanese pilots was the coordinated nature of the defensive fire, as Master Sergeant David Chun in the upper central fire control position could transfer control of multiple turrets to gunners who had targets in their sectors, using a complex switching system that allowed a single gunner to control 2 or even 3 turrets simultaneously, all fed by the same computed firing solution, creating overlapping fields of fire that seemed to predict every evasive maneuver with supernatural accuracy. The Japanese pilots had trained extensively at the Akino Fighter School, where instructors like Captain Kuniyoshi Tanaka taught that American bombers' defensive fire patterns followed predictable human limitations, with reaction times of 1 to 2 seconds that could be exploited through violent maneuvers, barrel rolls, and skidding attacks that would force gunners to constantly recompute their aim. But these tactics assumed human gunners manually tracking targets, not analog computers solving ballistic equations at electronic speed. In Germany, Luftwaffe engineers at the Reckland test facility had experimented with remote-controlled defensive turrets for the Heinkel He-177 and other bombers, but their systems relied on direct electrical linkage between sight and guns without computational assistance, requiring gunners to still calculate lead manually, a limitation that Major Walter Nowotny of Jagdgeschwader 101 noted made them only marginally more effective than conventional manned turrets, nothing like the revolutionary system the Americans had secretly developed. The Italian aircraft manufacturer Piaggio had installed semi-remote controlled turrets on their P-108 heavy bomber, with engineer Giovanni Casuraghi designing a system where gunners operated turrets through mechanical linkages, but without any computational assistance for lead calculation, forcing gunners to still estimate deflection manually while wrestling with mechanical controls, a system that Major Antonio Vizzato of the 274th Long-Range Bombardment Squadron described as barely adequate. Against slow-moving targets, hopeless against modern fighters. Colonel Koji Tanaka, observing the B-29 raid from the ground at Nakajima Aircraft Company's Musashino engine plant, watched through binoculars as Zero fighters repeatedly broke off attacks at ranges far beyond normal engagement distance. Their pilots clearly frustrated by defensive fire that seemed to anticipate their every move, and he immediately recognized that these new American bombers possessed some form of advanced fire control system unlike anything encountered in 3 years of war. Against B-17s and B-24s. The B-29 Central Fire Control System represented years of development that had begun in March 1940 when Bendix, General Electric, Sperry, and Westinghouse submitted proposals to the Army Air Corps, with Sperry initially winning the contract for a complex periscope-based system, but General Electric's simpler direct sighting approach ultimately prevailed after Sperry's system encountered insurmountable technical problems, leading to the installation of GE's revolutionary system in nearly 4,000 B-29s. Each analog computer contained hundreds of electrical relays, mechanical switches that could open and close circuits in milliseconds, processing electrical signals from the sighting stations through what IBM engineers called a maze of precisely calibrated resistors and capacitors, with each component representing a mathematical function in the ballistic equation, from the parabolic curve of bullet drop to the logarithmic decrease in velocity caused by air resistance, all integrated through differential analyzers that could solve equations mechanically. The ranging system alone represented a triumph of analog computing, with the gunner adjusting a dial to match a circle of dots to the enemy fighter's wingspan. This mechanical input converted to electrical resistance that told the computer the target's approximate range, which then modified every other calculation from bullet time of flight to the amount of lead needed, all happening continuously as the range changed, the computer solving new equations dozens of times per second. Japanese fighter pilot Lieutenant Yoshio Yoshida of the 244th Air Regiment, attempting his third pass on the bomber formation, noticed something that chilled him to his core as he watched tracers from multiple B-29s create what looked like a perfectly calculated curtain of fire, with bullets from different bombers converging on predicted intercept points rather than following his actual flight path, a level of coordination that suggested the Americans had developed something far beyond conventional defensive armament. The thermonic vacuum tubes in parts of the system, glowing softly in their shock-mounted cases, amplified the tiny electrical signals from the rate gyroscopes, converting the mechanical measurement of angular velocity into electrical voltages that could be processed by the computer's relay logic, while mechanical differentials physically added and subtracted shaft rotations to combine multiple corrections into a single output that moved the turret's twin 50 caliber guns. Technical Sergeant Matthews, comfortable in his heated compartment at 70 degrees Fahrenheit while the outside temperature plummeted to minus 50 degrees, could smoothly track targets through his optical sight without the violent shaking and wind buffeting that plagued B-17 waist gunners. His steady tracking converted by the computer into precise turret movements that compensated for the bomber's own motion, the target's angular velocity, and even the curved trajectory of bullets firing through thin air at high altitude. The Amplidyne generators, specialized electrical amplifiers developed by General Electric, took the tiny electrical signals from the computer and amplified them into enough power to drive the half-horsepower motors in each turret, allowing smooth tracking at speeds up to 45 degrees per second in azimuth and 30 degrees per second in elevation, fast enough to track a fighter crossing perpendicular to the bomber's path at point-blank range. Lieutenant Commander Takahashi, making his fourth attack run, tried the desperation tactic of approaching from directly ahead, exploiting what he believed must be a blind spot in the bomber's defenses, only to face coordinated fire from both the upper and lower forward turrets, controlled by the bombardier in the nose compartment who could slave both turrets to his single gun sight, creating a convergent stream of 100 rounds per second exactly where Takahashi's Zero would be if it maintained its attack vector. The 5 IBM-manufactured analog computers in each B-29, working in parallel but capable of independent operation if one was damaged, represented more computational power dedicated to defensive gunnery than existed in entire Japanese aircraft factories, each computer containing over 3,000 individual components from resistors and capacitors to mechanical cams and differentials, all working together to solve the complex mathematics of aerial gunnery. Major Genda Minoru, observing from the ground and recognizing the tactical implications of what he was witnessing, immediately understood that Japan's entire fighter doctrine would need to be reconsidered, as the traditional advantage of fighter maneuverability against bomber defensive fire had been negated by American technology that could predict where an aircraft would be rather than simply shooting where it was, a fundamental shift in the mathematics of aerial combat. The B-29 system could even account for the bomber's own evasive maneuvers, with the computer automatically compensating for banking turns or altitude changes that would throw off a manually aimed gun, the turrets remaining locked on target even as the bomber pitched and rolled through flak bursts, a stability that Lieutenant Saburo Honda of the 47th Air Regiment described as fighting against machines that never tired, never panicked, never missed their calculations. German engineers at Messerschmitt, working on the remote turret system for the never-completed Me-264 strategic bomber, had proposed a similar computational system but lacked the industrial capacity to manufacture the thousands of precision electrical components required, with Dr. Heinrich Beauvais admitting in a post-war interrogation that Germany was at least 3 years behind American analog computer technology, particularly in the miniaturization required to fit such systems into aircraft. The Italian engineer Giovanni Casiraghi, who had designed the Piaggio P-108's defensive systems, studied captured B-29 technical documents after Italy's surrender, and was astounded by the complexity of the American system, particularly the use of parallax correction that allowed guns and sights to be separated by dozens of feet yet still fire accurately, something he had considered but dismissed as too complex for practical implementation. Colonel Takeo Doi of the Japanese Army Air Force Technical Division, analyzing combat reports from the November 24th raid, calculated that B-29 gunners were achieving hit rates 3 times higher than B-17 or B-24 gunners despite engaging at longer ranges, a statistical impossibility unless the Americans had developed some form of automated fire control, leading him to recommend immediate research into countermeasures that never materialized due to Japan's limited resources. The Central Fire Control System's most devastating capability was its ability to engage multiple targets simultaneously, with Staff Sergeant James Rodriguez in the right blister position engaging a Ki 44 Shoki fighter approaching from 3 o'clock while simultaneously controlling the lower rear turret to fire on another fighter at 5 o'clock, both turrets receiving computed firing solutions that accounted for the different angles and ranges to each target, something no human gunner could achieve manually. Lieutenant Takashi Maeda of the 4th Air Regiment, flying one of the new Ki-84 Hay-8 fighters specifically designed to intercept B-29s, found that even his fighter's superior speed and altitude capability meant nothing against turrets that began firing accurate bursts at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards, with tracers creating a mathematical pattern in the sky that seemed to predict his every evasive maneuver before he made it, forcing him to break off attacks without ever reaching effective cannon range. The computer's range calculation system, based on the simple principle of optical stadiometry where the apparent size of an object of known dimensions indicated its distance, fed continuously updated range data into the ballistic equation, modifying the lead calculation as the fighter closed, ensuring that the stream of 50 caliber bullets would always intersect the target's flight path regardless of changing range, a level of mathematical precision that no human could maintain under combat stress. Japanese Naval Captain Minoru Genda, creator of the Pearl Harbor attack plan, watching the B-29 formations defend themselves with unprecedented effectiveness, told his staff that Japan faced a technological gulf that could not be bridged with courage alone, that the Americans had mechanized the art of aerial gunnery in the same way they had mechanized automobile production, turning what had been a human skill into an industrial process. The B-29 system even included provision for gunner fatigue, with the computer maintaining its calculations regardless of how long the mission lasted, while human gunners in B-17s and B-24s progressively lost effectiveness during 8-hour missions, their aim deteriorating as cold, exhaustion, and combat stress took their toll, factors that had given Axis fighters better odds in prolonged engagements. Master Sergeant Paul Anderson, manning the tail gun position in B-29 Lucky Strike, had the unique perspective of operating the only position that retained manual control as a backup, but even his position benefited from computer assistance when he used the primary sight, watching as his twin 50 caliber guns and 20mm cannon automatically adjusted for the complex ballistics of high-altitude shooting, placing rounds exactly where his gun sight indicated despite the thin air and extreme cold. The Japanese pilots, trained to exploit human weaknesses and limitations, found themselves fighting machines that exhibited none of the telltale signs of human gunners under stress. No wild shooting when surprised, no overcorrection when tracking fast targets, no fatigue-induced inaccuracy late in the mission, just the same mechanical precision whether it was the first or fifth hour of combat. A consistency that Lieutenant Commander Takahashi described as fighting against death itself. Inevitable and mathematical. The Central Fire Control System's computers could process multiple target tracks simultaneously, with the upper gunner acting as a fire control coordinator, using override switches to assign turrets to gunners who had the best shooting angles, creating a defensive network where every turret could potentially engage any target within its field of fire, controlled by whichever gunner had the best position, a flexibility that multiplied the effective firepower by a factor of 3. German Luftwaffe General Adolf Galland, reviewing intelligence reports about B-29 defensive capabilities, noted that such a system would have been devastating against German fighters over Europe, where the majority of bomber losses came from fighters exploiting the reaction time delays and coordination problems between human gunners, weaknesses that apparently no longer existed in the American Superfortress. The Italian Air Force attaché in Tokyo, Colonel Mario Bonzano, witnessing B-29 operations and comparing them to his experience against B-17s and B-24s over the Mediterranean, reported to Rome that the Americans had achieved a revolutionary breakthrough in defensive armament, essentially removing human error from the gunnery equation and replacing it with mechanical precision that made traditional fighter tactics obsolete. Each B-29 computer performed approximately 10,000 calculations per second, processing inputs from multiple sensors and controls, solving differential equations that accounted for relative motion in 3 dimensions, environmental factors affecting ballistics, and the geometric relationship between sights and guns, all while maintaining stability through vibration, temperature changes, and the violent maneuvers of combat, a reliability that seemed impossible to Japanese engineers familiar with the delicate nature of precision instruments. The ranging system's elegance lay in its simplicity from the gunner's perspective, who simply turned a knob to make a circle of dots match the enemy fighter's wingspan, unaware that this simple action initiated a cascade of electrical signals through the computer, modifying dozens of calculations from bullet drop compensation to lead angle, all adjusted in real time as the range changed, the mechanical computation happening faster than human thought. Lieutenant Naoshi Kano of the 301st Fighter Squadron, one of Japan's most experienced B-24 killers with 12 confirmed victories against American heavy bombers, found his proven tactics useless against B-29s. His signature barrel roll attack that had confused dozens of human gunners met with perfectly predicted fire that forced him to abort at ranges where he would normally be closing for the kill, leading him to report that fighting these new bombers is like fighting against mathematicians who can see the future. The computer system's reliability exceeded even American expectations, with less than 2% failure rate during combat missions despite the complexity of thousands of interconnected components, each computer undergoing 500 hours of testing before installation, with IBM quality control engineers rejecting units that showed even minor variations in computational accuracy, a level of precision that Japanese industry could not match even in much simpler systems. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was devastating, with many experiencing what flight surgeons called technological despair. The realization that their years of training and combat experience meant nothing against American machines that could calculate their future position with mathematical certainty, leading to a crisis of confidence that spread through fighter units assigned to home defense, pilots who had been eager for combat now dreading encounters with B-29s. Technical analysis by the Japanese Army Technical Research Institute determined that duplicating the American system would require importing precision manufacturing equipment that didn't exist in Japan, training thousands of technicians in analog computer construction, and developing quality control processes that exceeded anything in Japanese industry, with Colonel Hideo Matsuda estimating it would take 5 years minimum to produce even a simplified version, time that Japan clearly didn't have. The Central Fire Control System represented an investment of over $100 million in research and development, more than the entire Japanese aircraft industry's annual budget, with General Electric alone employing 3,000 engineers and technicians on the project, while IBM's manufacturing facility in Endicott, New York dedicated 2 entire buildings to computer production, turning out units at a rate that exceeded Japan's entire electronics industry output. By December 1944, after multiple encounters with B-29s equipped with central fire control systems, Japanese fighter tactics had completely broken down, with pilots resorting to desperate ramming attacks as the only way to guarantee hitting the bombers, a tactical admission that conventional interception had become mathematically impossible against computers that could predict and counter every evasive maneuver, leading to the loss of irreplaceable experienced pilots for minimal bomber casualties. Captain Yoshitsugu Saito of the 70th Air Regiment, leading a coordinated attack by 16 Ki-61 Hien fighters against a formation of B-29s over Nagoya, watched in horror as his entire squadron was met with perfectly synchronized defensive fire from multiple bombers, their computers creating interlocking fields of tracers that seemed to anticipate every attack vector, forcing his pilots to scatter without achieving a single confirmed kill, while 2 of his fighters fell to the precise defensive fire. The system's ability to maintain accuracy during evasive maneuvers gave B-29s unprecedented survivability, with gunners able to continue engaging targets even as their bomber executed sharp turns to avoid flak, the computers automatically compensating for the G-forces and angular momentum that would make manual gunnery impossible, creating a stable gun platform regardless of the aircraft's motion through 3-dimensional space. German engineers studying captured B-29 technical manuals after the war expressed amazement at the use of mechanical differentiation to solve calculus problems in real time, with Dr. Werner Holzbauer of Siemens calling it an elegant solution to problems we were trying to solve with vacuum tubes and electrical circuits. The Americans simply built mechanical calculators that could process continuously variable inputs, an approach we had dismissed as too complex. The Italian government's post-war technical assessment concluded that the B-29's defensive system represented a 5-year leap in technology over anything the Axis powers had contemplated, with the combination of remote turrets, analog computers, and integrated fire control creating a weapons system that transcended traditional concepts of bomber defense, essentially turning each B-29 into an automated fortress that could defend itself with minimal human intervention. Major Iwao Hayashi of the Japanese Naval Air Technical Arsenal, tasked with developing countermeasures, concluded that the only effective tactic was attacking from ranges beyond the computer's effective calculation distance, but this meant engaging at over 2,000 yards where Japanese 20mm cannons had minimal accuracy and hitting a moving target became largely a matter of luck, essentially negating Japan's advantage in fighter aircraft while leaving B-29s free to bomb with impunity. The manufacturing precision required for the central fire control system exceeded anything in Axis military production, with tolerances measured in 0.010 of an inch for critical components, each Selson motor calibrated to within 1/10 of a degree, every resistor tested to ensure it maintained its specified resistance across temperature ranges from -60 to +120 degrees Fahrenheit, quality standards that pushed American industry to new heights of precision. Manufacturing. Lieutenant Commander Takahashi, surviving his first encounter with B-29 defensive fire, reported to Naval Headquarters that traditional fighter combat had become obsolete, that attacking these new American bombers was like fighting against the future itself, where the enemy knows where you will be before you do, an assessment that led Admiral Somu Toyota to conclude that Japan had lost the technological race and could only hope to delay the inevitable through sacrifice. The B-29 raids continued with mechanical precision, each mission demonstrating the superiority of automated fire control over human courage and skill, with loss rates for Japanese interceptors climbing to unsustainable levels while B-29 casualties remained minimal. The mathematics of air combat fundamentally altered by American analog computers that could solve ballistic equations faster than Japanese pilots could think, creating a technological gap that no amount of training or determination could overcome. Colonel Koji Tanaka's final report to Imperial General Headquarters, written after analyzing 6 months of B-29 operations, stated bluntly that Japan faced an enemy that had mechanized warfare to a degree beyond Japanese comprehension, that the central fire control system represented not just superior technology but a fundamentally different approach to combat, where mathematical certainty replaced human judgment and machines performed calculations that surpassed human capability. The German Luftwaffe's Technical Intelligence Division, studying B-29 systems captured after emergency landings in Soviet territory, concluded that even if Germany had possessed the industrial capacity to produce similar systems, which it didn't, the organizational capability to integrate such complex technology into operational aircraft exceeded Wehrmacht capabilities, with General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland admitting that Germany had focused on pilot skill while America had invested in technology that made pilot skill irrelevant. By March 1945, Japanese fighter pilots had developed a bitter joke that attacking B-29s was like playing chess against an opponent who could see 10 moves ahead, where every maneuver was countered before it was executed, where the mathematics of the American computers created an invisible cage of calculated trajectories that no amount of courage or skill could penetrate, leading to a fundamental collapse in fighter morale that contributed to Japan's inability to defend against the devastating firebombing campaign. The Central Fire Control System's ultimate vindication came not in its combat success, but in the decision by General Curtis LeMay to remove most defensive armament for low-level night raids. A choice only possible because the system had so thoroughly dominated daylight fighter opposition that Japanese pilots refused to engage B-29s in coordinated attacks, the psychological impact of fighting unbeatable mathematics proving more devastating than the physical destruction of aircraft. Technical Sergeant Matthews, completing his 35th mission over Japan, had personally controlled turrets that shot down 3 confirmed Japanese fighters and damaged 7 others, achievements that would have been impossible with manual gunnery. His success rate nearly triple that of B-17 gunners in Europe, a statistical validation of the $100 million investment in analog computing technology that had turned aerial gunnery from art into science. The Italian assessment of American fire control technology, conducted by engineers from Breda, Fiat, and Piaggio, concluded that Italy's entire electronics industry would need to be rebuilt from scratch to produce even simplified versions of the B-29's computers, that the precision manufacturing, quality control, and systems integration required exceeded not just Italian capabilities but the combined capabilities of all Axis powers, a technological gulf that represented the difference between industrial craft and industrial mass production. Japanese pilots who survived encounters with B-29s described a peculiar sensation of fighting against omniscient opponents, where the bomber's defensive fire seemed to anticipate thoughts rather than react to actions, creating an almost supernatural aura around the American bombers that contributed to the rapid collapse of organized fighter resistance, pilots refusing missions they considered mathematically impossible to survive, a breakdown in warrior spirit caused not by fear of death but by the futility of fighting against calculated certainty. The B-29 Central Fire Control System ultimately claimed 914 Japanese aircraft according to American records, though Japanese sources acknowledge only about 300 losses to bomber defensive fire, but even this lower figure represented a 3-to-1 improvement over B-17 and B-24 effectiveness, proving that analog computers had fundamentally changed the mathematics of aerial warfare, replacing human limitations with mechanical precision that no amount of pilot skill could overcome. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, Japan's leading surviving ace, encountering B-29s late in the war after recovering from injuries, described the experience as fighting against angels of mathematics, where every movement was met with calculated response, where the traditional dance of fighter combat became a predetermined equation with only one solution, the destruction of any aircraft that entered the bomber's computational envelope, a reality that marked the end of the age of individual warrior pilots. The legacy of the Central Fire Control System extended beyond World War II, establishing the principle that technology could replace human skill in combat, that mathematical certainty could overcome courage and training, lessons that would shape military development through the Cold War and beyond. The B-29's analog computers representing the first step toward automated warfare, where machines would make decisions faster and more accurately than humans ever could. In the final analysis, as Colonel Minoru Genda wrote in his post-war memoirs, Japan never expected that American industry could mechanize the art of aerial gunnery, turning what had always been a human skill requiring years of training into an industrial process that could be mass-produced and installed in thousands of aircraft, each B-29 carrying more computational power than existed in entire Japanese cities. A technological revolution that Japan discovered too late to counter the war's outcome, determined not by courage or skill but by the cold mathematics of analog computers calculating ballistic trajectories with inhuman precision. The story of the B-29 Central Fire Control System serves as a watershed moment in military history, when the advantage shifted permanently from human skill to technological superiority, when analog computers proved that mathematical calculation could overcome human judgment, when Japanese pilots discovered that their years of training meant nothing against American machines that could predict the future with electronic certainty, transforming aerial combat from an art into a science, from a contest of human wills into an equation with predetermined outcomes, the beginning of an age where victory would belong not to the brave but to those who could build the better computer.